So indeed, my name is Aki JARVINEN. That's how you pronounce it.
What was that again?
JARVINEN.
Yeah, see, anybody can say that?
All right. But so okay, today I'm gonna talk to you about the state of social games. What is the status of social in social games at the moment? And so, are there any social game developers in the room? How many of you want to make these games more social? I knew it. All right. So let's look into that. I'm sort of swimming against the tide here because I'm actually going to say that sometimes less social can be more, but we'll come back to that. So the starting point is there's been quite a lot of discussion about social being broken in social games, that these games are not as social as they're supposed to be. They are called social games, but they might be unsocial, antisocial, or whatever. So this talk and this subject matter really first arise from that sort of my personal puzzlement that what is going on, what is social, and why are people sort of finding the need to question that these games are not social and so forth. So let's look at some of these sort of quotations or outcries from the game developers. So there's been different talks in different venues, GDC, wherever. Well, people have been voicing these concerns, and here's one from a game developer that social games, sociality in them currently is more like passing notes under the door rather than knocking on the door and meeting the person face to face. Or there's been criticism, more like an academic criticism, where social games are really only turning social relationships in a social network into mere game resources, and that's been seen as a sort of a bad thing. And also even game developers, like social game designers, have been admitting that they are really, at different points of time, they have been using techniques where they actually sort of try to trick the players to feel that the game is more social than it actually is. And this kind of criticism has been gone to the length that there was a recent feature at Gamasutra by a game design veteran, Greg Kostikian, whom I respect very much. He was also criticizing that actually social games are unsocial, antisocial, and his main concern was that whenever the developers introduce social features to these games, it's really just to move the needle, the metrics, acquire, retain, or monetize players, and it's not geared towards creating more interesting gameplay. And well, in some cases, I'm here to prove him wrong, and in some cases, I think that's just the nature of the business, and that is very much down to the free-to-play business model that we are working with. But I'll return to that later. So if the game developers are puzzled and sort of concerned, so, well, what about the players? Now, even if these games are supposedly built on the premise of being social, there haven't been that many studies into, at least qualitative studies into social game players. But there was one in Finland, where I come from, in a university, and they were studying and interviewing social games players, and who had sort of hard time articulating what it is that they actually do when they interact with their friends within these games. So there seems to be something going on, something fishy. So are they social? Are they games at all? Are they real games? And everything like that. So that is really the premise and the motivation for this talk. Now, before we go into the social aspects and some concepts that I want to sort of unravel this topic with, I've been using this kind of a working definition of what social games are. And this is meant to be a general definition that doesn't, is sort of platform agnostic, so that whether it's Facebook, Google+, Twitter, or whatever, this would work. Here's how it goes. They are online games that adapt your friendship ties for play purposes while accommodating your daily routines. So this is a definition that very much emphasizes the very casual nature of these games. So rather than these games as products asking you to dedicate and reserve a certain amount of time or a certain place for gaming, they sort of accommodate to your routines, whether it's at work or home or wherever. And now, what I've been working mostly with Digital Chocolate has been Facebook games, and Facebook games sort of present one particular instance of this definition. But anyhow, what I'm really going to talk about is that I'm going to establish this kind of a tension between what is supposedly and what is perceived as being less social, and then on the other hand what is being perceived as being more social. And what I'm really going to say is that from this kind of tension and juxtaposition, what has been happening is that there is a new kind of social aesthetic working in social games for the players, and we shouldn't really judge it by the same standards necessary that we use to judge social in games and game design. Alright, so one way to try to distinguish what is less and what is more social is to take a particular case study. And here we have Frontierville and Farmville, and this is particularly relevant because when Brian Reynolds, who's the chief designer guy at Zynga, started Frontierville, he has said that one of the key design drivers and goals was that they want to make a game that is more social than Farmville. And now, then, of course, if you the logical conclusion would be that, okay, let's compare these games and see what Farmville does not have and what Frontierville does have, and then we see what makes a social game more social. But I won't go into that because I want to emphasize another aspect that has been already sort of emphasized and discussed about on this stage is the service aspect of these games. So we can't really distinguish and identify the features that Frontierville inherited from Farmville and the features that Farmville has since inherited from Frontierville. So whether they are social more or less it can't really be said at least in any kind of uniform way. So, and now, of course, there's like Empires and Allies from Zynga and Cityville, so we might presume that, especially with Empires and Allies, has a PvP feature, so it's supposed to be even more social, or is it? Those are the questions that I want to pose. So what I'm really saying is that when we judge the social, the degree, whether it's less or more of social in social games, we should pay more attention to the social context where these games are distributed and published. And of course, with these examples that I'm going to use, it's Facebook. So we should really look beyond that canvas that has the game itself and to the context, which is really the beef why people use Facebook. And the sort of slightly provocative statement is that what if less is more in this space? So what if we try to build more deep social mechanics into these games and more sophisticated game mechanics? Does that mean that we will get more players or more dedicated players? I think the bottom line still is that these games, especially in Facebook, have established new standards, especially when it comes to the UI of how accessible, how easy to find things are, how easy to understand the game mechanics and the game goals and everything is. And therefore, once you start adding information, which usually happens when you start adding depth, you run into interface problems and you are going into the direction where the UI becomes cluttered, the game experience becomes more complicated and more difficult to understand. There's too much cognitive load for your average mainstream Facebook player. So what I'm really saying is that if you decide to go for the more social part and that kind of business side, you are really starting to shape your audience from day one once you make that decision. And we'll come back to that later, how a niche audience can be profitable and viable. There's nothing wrong with that. But what I want to sort of raise to the table is that those can be conscious decisions that you take. And also, like, regarding all this, like, these are not real games and whatever, I don't really care. I mean, these are games that people who play this game discuss them as games. It's really kind of a useless discussion, at least the way I think about it. And I mean, if the Facebook games business space, for instance, had evolved in a way that only companies without any prior experience of developing games would have stayed there, we don't really know what kinds of games we would see, because what has been happening, that game companies have been coming into Facebook. They have been starting to mold Facebook games into the schemas that we as sort of traditional game developers have, and there is an alternative sort of possible feature was there that wouldn't have happened, and so this discussion is sort of, I feel, irrelevant anyway. And so I come back to this picture, which you're going to see a number of times in the next 30 minutes or so. So I really believe that there is a new aesthetic of social that has emerged in successful social games. There's one criteria I've set there, that if you reach over 500,000 DAU, you have a successful game nowadays in Facebook. If you reach 1 million, I think then you really have a hit. And with that 500,000 DAU, you can really make business. And whether then you are at what point of that sort of spectrum between less and more social, I think you need to be somewhere in between and need to sort of embrace the new social aesthetic. And I will be sort of unraveling what that means in what comes. All right. So I also have a Ph.D. About games and psychology and emotion and stuff like that. So that my academic side will come to the front in the next 20 minutes, because I do believe that once you sort of find concepts that crystallize and structure a chaos, like for instance, what is social, then you can have a clearer understanding of what is it that you're working with. So I'm going to use and introduce a couple of concepts like this. I'm going to talk about social as communication, I'm going to talk about social graph, social capital, and that will help us understand how does that new aesthetic actually get formed, how does it emerge. So when you look at social, it's really about communication. So if you think about your relationships between people, they are not really possible without communication. And the more communication there is, the more intimate the relationship is. So if you adapt that to a game situation, the more communication there is between the players within a gameplay session, probably the more emotional and intimate that is as well. Now, when you're working with an online platform like Facebook, you are really, to start with, you are tied with the communication channels that the platform provides you with. So Facebook, for instance, is a social substrate, and it's also a viral substrate that gives you sort of ground where to fertilize your sort of degree of how social you want to be. So if you feel the need that your game needs other sort of extra or more nuanced or more extend flexible communication channels than what Facebook as such provides, then you are taking a step towards the more school of aesthetics in the social space. Here is a picture from Wild Ones, which has a chat, for instance, because even if Facebook provides a chat, you can't really use it within the canvas in a way that this game needs. So in order to meet the goals of the game, the developers felt the need to introduce a real-time chat to the game, and that of course makes the communication for those who embrace it more intimate, more real-time, and you might get a stronger sense of social presence of the other players. So that is one of the concepts that I'm going to use here is social presence. Now, this is a painting illustrating how kids often play. So they are playing essentially with the same tools, same resources, in this case sand, drawing to the sand or asphalt or whatever, but they are basically making their own drawings. And every once in a while, what usually happens in this kind of setting is that then they check back on what the others are doing, then maybe go back to to what they're doing. And this has been dubbed in studies of children's play as parallel play. And this is, of course, I think very much what happens in Facebook games, for instance. You have your own restaurant, cafe, farm, city, whatever, you play with it. The other guys, your friends, come to check upon it every once in a while, but then you get back to your own thing. So why I'm choosing this example is that this helps us understand where we are in terms of the social presence that Facebook games currently deliver, so to speak. So it is really very much about parallel play, that you play independently, you check on the other's progress from time to time, but what is important in terms of the concept of social presence and the intimacy is that this kind of arrangement of the players and their interactions affects that. So as long as there's a game, let's say a Facebook game, which is based on your sort of homestead, whether it's a farm or a military front or whatever, then you're more or less bound to parallel play. And if you look at this kind of a phenomenon from the perspective of traditional game design, multiplayer games, social games, it very well might be perceived as being less social than what people want to build. But still, it's working. So to really nail down social presence, what it really means is that it's about the salience of others while you communicate and interact with them across distance. And it's the degree of how aware you are of their being there. And of course, in most Facebook games, this gets sort of watered down, you could say, because games are asynchronous. The visits you made to your friends' farms and whatnot are asynchronous, so there is already sort of a step removed from a sort of synchronous, real-time presence of others. But once again, what I want to raise here is that is increased presence necessarily more? It's more demanding, it can be intimidating towards many players, and so on and so forth. So making games more social in this sense is not necessarily more in terms of your product and in game. And presence, what it requires, as you see from these examples, is immediacy, that you are immediately able to interact or communicate with the others. So it's true, what Facebook games have achieved so far is that they have had this kind of a weak impact in terms of social presence, that they really have been about slipping that message under the door instead of knocking on the door, and so this kind of a immediate interaction hasn't really belonged to the vocabulary of social games. But there has been steps towards greater immediacy. But what is interesting here is an example from Gardens of Time, and many games do this nowadays, that they have this own message center, which basically makes it more immediate and accessible and convenient to send requests and accept requests from friends. So you can do it sort of within the game in Canvas rather than going back and forth from the game to the request page on Facebook and so on and so forth. So, but what it is interesting here is that, of course, remembering, for instance, Greg Kostikian's critique, this is not happening like within the canvas, in the actual gameplay, you could say. It's happening sort of on the periphery, on what has to do with sending invites, sending requests, the sort of communication layer that Facebook facilitates. But my point here is that it is exactly these kinds of changes, that the move towards the social context, that are building the new social aesthetic in these games. And we should judge the degree of them being less or more social based on these kinds of observations rather than sticking to the sort of old schemas of what games are supposed to be about and where the essence of gameplay lies. And also, of course, virals are social. Virals are a means of communication within the Facebook platform. And they are really the in-your-face form of social. So if you think about these games with the parallel play aspect and you take the virals away, you are really left with a single-player game, right? at least how the game appears to your friends who are not necessarily even playing the game. So what this really points or puts stress and importance towards is that you need to create socially acceptable virals. And there's a better concept I've used here is that you need to create virals that players feel that they are share-worthy, and then again those players who see them, they see them as click-worthy, so that that viral loop starts emerging and looping. And really, what has changed in the last year and a half is that viral with Facebook games has really become a retention tool rather than an acquisition tool. So it's really for the existing players to keep them coming back and honing that marriage, as Ralph Koster put it earlier today. All right. So if I summarize something about social presence, it's really that, okay, if there's no sense of social presence, the presence of others, there's not really no socially relevant retention. You are essentially creating a single-player game. If you are aiming for a strong sense of presence, you might create niche retention, so that a more social game, and you might create more high-density virals. What that means is that rather than a large amount of people sending virals every now and then, you get a very tightly knit group who are sending virals all the time between themselves. And then you have a niche market that is very committed to the game, probably is willing to pay for the game, and then it's really about how high you can scale that up in terms of numbers of players. So it can be viable, but that is really once again, a design and development decision that you have made, and there's only so much that you can expect after that. All right, so enough about social presence. I will go through a couple of other concepts. Social graph is pretty familiar probably to everyone. It really has become sort of owned by Facebook, but social capital is something else that I will use also to explain why these games, at least at present, are sort of less social than some of you might maybe want them to be. Okay, so social graph is really about sort of being able to visualize and seeing patterns in the social relationships between people. And what it has really come to sort of wider recognition is that it implies that it brings additional value to your application or your service or your game. So that if you are able to leverage the social graph to your game, for instance, then it enriches the social experience. That's the assumption. And of course, I mean, there are other services and platforms and networks other than Facebook that have social graphs. But what is important to understand is that if you take a look at Xbox Live or Steam, they create interest-driven social graphs rather than relationship-driven interest graphs or social graphs. So what that means is that the people are there first and foremost to play games rather than look at the photos of their friends and whatnot, which is the case with Facebook. But this is definitely something that is happening also within Facebook. So interest graph is a subset of social graph that, for instance, social media theorists like Brian Solis have been talking about. And where we see this in terms of Facebook games is what I call the admin culture, which you see a screenshot here, that whenever there's a product page for a Facebook game and the developers post news and so on and so forth, it's always followed by a string of people wanting other people to add them as friend in Facebook so that they would get more neighbors and more sort of resources in the game. And so they are willing to make the game the sort of key common denominator between their friendship rather than some sort of other real life relationship relation. So this is definitely what's happening. And then of course, what is the distinguishing feature with Facebook games is that there's no anonymity. So it's really the friends who consist and create your gamer graph, which is another sort of subset of social and interest graphs. But this is important in terms of emotional impact, because I think it has come up within this event a couple of times already that people's faces, which are usually what people use as their profile picture, they evoke emotions. They function as kind of signposts for social emotions. And they are not trivial, so even if this could once be, again, the sort of friends bar, could be dubbed as kind of a less social feature that somebody would want to implement in their game, it's not a trivial feature. I wouldn't say that it's less in any sense. But this does bring up the question of friends versus strangers, because now, for instance, here, this is part of my friends as gamer graph. They are my friends. I know them all. They are not strangers. So what happens when strangers come into the picture in a social network like Facebook, and what does that mean in terms of social capital? Well, it really articulates this kind of a division that has always existed in human networks way before there was computers or whatever. So there's always been cooperation and competition, and so this kind of like tension gets articulated in Facebook games as well. But still, in most Facebook games, you don't really find strangers. And this kind of a less of a solution is due to the fact that is sort of built around the core use case of Facebook. It's built around the fact that you're supposed to know these people and they're supposed to have some kind of meaning beyond games or apps or stuff like that. But then again, on the more front, as we've seen already in other talks in this event, player versus player is definitely gaining ground, and it seems to be definitely the way to go when you're starting to address a more niche audience that has this is geared towards the more competitive edge. But anyhow, this also relates to how this kind of a new aesthetic that I'm arguing for here is taking shape. So the question really is that if you have, there's no doubt you do, have this revolutionary gaming development, and you are arguing that it's going to revolutionize Facebook gaming because it's going to be more social. There's also one more thing, which is that even if you would be happy to embrace this kind of atomy culture, try to leverage that into your game, people finding strangers, making their friends, and therefore growing the game. There's also the fact that what we found out that you really have to also support the single player experience. It's easy as a developer to get sort of a very clouded judgment towards how many friends in these games people by average have. Like when I start playing game, I know that from our studio almost like 80% of the people will be playing it, so I can easily get like 50 friends or neighbors into the game. But by average, the average Facebook user might have like 2. And then when you start building like social barriers in terms of requests and virals and whatnot, you easily lose those players because they just can't cope with that kind of a social mechanic. So there is this kind of a paradox going on. That you, on the other hand, these are supposed to be social games and built on that premise, but you also have to support the single player experience, which sounds weird. Okay, social capital, I already mentioned that it's really about how dedicated you want your players to be. Social capital is defined as being the intangible value of one's social network, so it's not really about the individuals, but about the sort of relations and their power, sort of the structures in that network and how you can leverage that. So if you know somebody influential, you might benefit from that, and so on and so forth. And people who have been studying this phenomenon have defined like 2 types of social capital. There's the bridging type, which means that those ties that it forms are sort of weak. They usually center around just exchanging information, maybe exchanging some thoughts or whatever. But then there's another type which is very much based on emotional and close relationships, and that's the bonding type. And how these come about, for instance, from my personal Facebook life, there's a couple of examples. This is my post-dissertation after party, so this is definitely the bonding type of a social capital going on there. So it's based on the emotionally type relationship. I know these people, I like them, I love them. And then there's the sort of less school of social capital. Well, this is from Zuma Blitz. There's a simple leaderboard where social capital sort of is there, but it doesn't really have any meaning to me in the game itself. So it's at best of the breaching type. And now as a developer, you might want to sort of, think that, my game will have this bonding type of social capital. It will have strong players with lots of influence, and they will be able to help the weaker players and stuff like that. But in order to get that point, you need a very strong dedication from those influential players. And now when we put this together with the sort of typical low maintenance nature of these games, the very casual nature, it really comes down to that any social capital that thus far has been emerging is breaching in nature at best. So whenever one of my colleagues or friends sends a request for something, it doesn't really mean anything more than that. There is this kind of weak breaching capital going on in terms of context of the game itself. But anyhow, that does work for certain metrics. I'll come back to that later. But so what I'm really asking here is that do you want to create social mechanics like alliances and guilds, which include role differentiation, different power structures, the whole those building blocks for social capital? Do you want to do that? Which is asking quite a lot from your regular Facebook player, or do you just be happy to let them breach and use the game as a kind of a way to enjoy some casual gaming? Then I'm going to embark on a very short case study of how these things come together in a concrete way. For instance, and introduce another term which has to do with space and how space is social. Now, this relates to the sense of the concept of presence I was explaining earlier, and how, for instance, asynchronicity figures in these games. So the point is that sense of shared space is very paramount to authentic social experience, and that's what these games have working for them. So if you have that homestead where the other players can visit, and it has certain meaning and benefit in terms of gameplay, what it has going for it is that it is built around that schema of whether it's a restaurant where your patrons visit, or whether it's a city where people can visit as tourists or whatever, or whether it's a military front where you can support the friend with friendly fire and whatever. It has that idea that you are sharing the same game space, and that contributes to the social experience and the sort of authenticity of that. And there are now a couple of examples how this happens in practice. So most of you playing Facebook games are pretty familiar probably with this one, which I've dubbed like the ghost mechanic, which is sort of takes the, sort of you could say the limitation of asynchronicity, but turns it on its head and makes it actually, I think, a strength to the game, because it contributes to the social presence, the awareness of other people, how they are playing the game and how they visit your city, in this example, in Cityville. But of course, if you look at this once again through the lens of traditional game design, it doesn't really appear as something that contributes to a more social game, at least at first glance maybe. So once again, I've stamped this with the less stamp here. Another example that takes use of what you can do, a social mechanic very prominent in Facebook, is gifting. This is from City of Wonder, where you can gift an embassy to another player, and what you're essentially doing when that player builds and places that embassy into their city is that you are gifting shared space, because then the player can come back and there's a reason to come back to visit the friend's city, because he can collect rewards from that embassy that has been placed there. And of course, as the screenshot testifies, there's also a viral loop tied into that, so it works for retention also in that sense. All right, so before I go into unraveling and saying some concluding remarks about the more versus less social thing, here are a couple of things to sort of summarize. So yes, social is communication. It's if you want to start building extra channels of communication on top of the social network you are working with, that might be a risk in terms of intimidating the players and demanding extra commitment from them. If you want to build more social game, you need to pay attention how you build social presence, but that brings along with it the requirement of immediacy and real time. So should you just be content with some kind of like ambient social presence that we experience at the moment with Facebook, for instance? Social capital, once again, bridging versus bonding. Are you willing to risk building a game that demands bonding? If you can make it work, the upsides can be great, no doubt. And social space creates familiarity, so it's no coincidence that many of these games are set on farms and cafes, because, for instance, those spaces have like behavior schemas that we are not comfortable and familiar with, so it's easy to explain things within those settings. And viral is social, so yes, you can implement that without having to take a shower every time, and you should. All right, so let's get back to this juxtaposition between less and more. So now I'm really starting to sort of use examples how less becomes more and how this new kind of aesthetic is taking shape. So if we summarize what are the sort of things that I've mentioned that the school of more social is about, it's really about being real time, creating a strong sense of presence in that sense. It's about customized communication channels. It's about certain mechanics that you need to build on top of these and that support long-term commitment to the game and role differentiation and stuff like that. So alliances, guilds are examples. But if you manage to do that, you have great potential for making players to bond in an emotionally relevant way. But that does require from the players certain arrangements in time and space. And what is also important in terms of the business model, that usually where these games come from, which are supposedly more social, that they have to do with one-time investments of money. So if you compare that with the less social school of social game design and development, it's very much about the free-to-play model and the microtransactions. But the other features are that the social is kind of ambient in nature, it's always there on the background. It's asynchronous, there is the aspect of parallel play. There are requests and other communication that happens through the available channels that the platform has. And in a sense, your virality, for instance, is constrained with that, but also sort of open up based on those available channels. And then you have mechanics that are sort of inherent to social networks. There is sharing, there is neighboring, there is gifting. And this can be strong in a certain way. And then I come back to my very original definition about, or in the very beginning, the definition of what social games are, that these games, the less social ones, can be played whenever it suits the player in terms of time and space. So, now I'll give you some examples where less becomes more. So for instance, if you think about these kinds of inherent mechanics to social networks, tagging people in photos, inviting them, gifting them, sending requests. And then you take an aspect of the more social, like role-playing, where it really demands investment to the character, and there's of course great promise of change and a development with the character. But really, in this space, I think what becomes more rather than less is how you can make people sort of in a casual, less social manner start tagging, inviting, gifting, sharing between themselves. And it's very much, this argument has to do with the context, and the context is the context of social networks that is primarily meant for something else than gaming, even if that might be shifting as we speak. But then, so you might say that, okay, you're just saying so, but this is where I want to pull out the metrics card. So for instance, here are a couple of examples where we implemented in our games this kind of supposedly less social features and how they move the needle. So for instance, in Army Attack, one of our recent games, has been quite successful. We added a teaser sort of feature towards a new map where people can play, and it increased the daily requests sent by players by tens of thousands. Another thing at Zombie Lane, another one of our studio's games, is that we added a Centricon, which was a feature where you have to request parts for the Centricon from your friends. So it does require sending requests, sending those virals. But what happened was that it upped the DAU by 100K within a very short period of time. So these acts of an implementation of these less social features really became more in terms of retention and growth of the products. And now to sort of arrive at what is the name of this new social aesthetics within the orange emblem, it's really about the free-to-play business model and how as a social game developer, you have to sort of have this balancing act between making the players send requests, making them invite their friends, but then on the other hand, enabling them to continue the game even if they wouldn't have any friends. Of course, that is the case where in most cases we hope that those are the players that are also then willing to pay for the game and get past with those means. But this is really, the free-to-play business model affects every design decision we do in these games. It's really over a sort of arching thing in a sense. And if you don't pay attention to the single-player experience, this is what you end up with. This is a friend of mine who I know for a fact that has never paid for these games, but she was a very enthusiastic Frontierville player, and this is a quote from her. She needs 2 more of these survey authorizations, and she basically says that the social in hyphens in this game has gone too far because she has to spam. That's the perceived act that she has to make. At least her view is like that, that she has to spam her friends to get far from the game. And imagine if this person wouldn't have any friends playing the game, so she would have quit a while ago. So you have to really sort of balance those engaging gameplay versus those social and viral barriers that you want to build. So it's really, this is my punchline. It's really about the free social. That is the new aesthetic that these games have created. And I'll end with a couple more examples what this means. And this is also to answer to like Greg Kostikian and other critics. So for instance, with Army Attack, we have this feature called the water plant. It's a feature not really invented by us, but does work for us. So the more people you are able to invite into producing water for your troops in the game, the more water by hour you get. So there is a definite benefit for the game. It does help the players. I think it contributes to an interesting gameplay, unlike critics like Kostikian say. But of course the reality is that then we do want to provide a way to pay your way to freedom in a way, so that you can add friends and add to the production by paying. But there is always you will always get one certain amount of the resources, but you can sort of expand and add to your production by getting your friends to go along. A similar feature in Empires and Allies is how to extend neutrality. This is also relevant regarding the PvP discussion. So in this game they have made the decision that if there are players who are not comfortable with player versus player, they don't want players to attack them, then they can try to extend their neutrality by inviting players. And what is relevant here is that your one friend gives 18 hours of production, so you always, after every 18 hours, you have an incentive to send another request. And this is very much about what the free social is about. Another example is that what can work for the free social is also that how do you execute whatever is it that you can do with your friends. So I think what we've really nailed with Army Attack is that when you go to your friends' front, you feel really powerful helping them. You shoot from the sky and you played the game, you know what the goals and challenges are, so you really get this sense of helping them. And it also has a cool implementation, execution in terms of animations and sounds and everything. So even Ken Levine, who seems of Bioshock System Shock fame, seems to like it, or at least tried it. So we're very, very happy about that. But once again, one example of what the free social is about. And to end with, the free social is about, of course, about a gift economy. And what I want to sort of argue here is that gifting has always been a very powerful social act. So, and even if there are like tons and tons of gifts being sent within Facebook and these games every day, so that does inflate the gesture of giving gifts somewhat, but still, for the players of these games who need these resources, who want to continue playing, it does have relevance. So, this is my final slide. The free social is really the state of social in social games at present, I argue, and it is very much based on the free-to-play business model, and what it really brings about is the MPSOG, massively parallel single-player online games. So there is this paradox articulated into this kind of MPSOG. And what that means is that these games, the free social accommodates both free and paying players. It accommodates convenience, so you can, if you don't want to wait, you can pay, you can request to get further. So it's very much based on the virals and requests. That's the basis of the free and the retention. And also the free social is very aware of how the platform is changing. So it adapts to the industry and best practices and to the platform. So how Facebook changes, we need to live with that and change along with that. But the bottom line is, of course, that the free social is and needs to be about fun as well. So because what we found out really is that if you make the game fun, fun monetizes well. So that's how it works, and we have evidence that with our games. So the free social is not about anti-fun or anti-social, it's about definite types of social, it's about fun. So that's it, thank you. And so this is me at Twitter. I tweet almost solely about social games, so follow me if you're interested. Thanks.